Hi, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dennis Boers, Sea Change Team Leader, and I would like to welcome all of you to this fourth Sea Change webinar, and it's the first webinar in our 2012 series. And the title is Asking the Right Questions, M&E for Climate Change Adaptation. I would like to welcome all of you attendees who have already logged in, and a warm welcome as well to our presenter, Mr. Patrick Pringle of UKCIP. And I will introduce Patrick a little bit more in a moment. And also welcome to our panelists, Ms. Anna Coughlin, who works as the Asia Regional Monitoring and Evaluation Advisor of PACT, and also to Ms. Sangli Khan, who works for Sea Change on webinar development. Some of your attendees this afternoon are already Sea Change members and you already know about us. But for those who are new to Sea Change, I would like to explain that Sea Change is a community of practice with currently 160 members, and we develop a culture of high quality and rigorous M&E frameworks, approaches and methodologies for adaptive responses to climate change interventions and practices in Southeast Asia and beyond. This webinar, Asking the Right Questions, M&E for Climate Change Adaptation, fits very well with Sea Change's mission as such. Webinars are one way in which Sea Change is sharing best practices and lessons learned, guidelines and approaches, methods and tools and innovations to improve M&E practices. Next to the webinar, we also send out a weekly newsletter. We maintain a resource library, and we support our members in publishing their work and in speaking engagements at conferences, and we partner with other networks and communities like GAV-EO, Community of Practice Climate Evil, and also with the Adaptation Knowledge Platform and with the Asia Pacific Adaptation Network. Feel free to check out our platform after this webinar on www.seachangecop.org. And if you would be interested in knowing more about it, you'll find all the information there, and you can also register as a member. A little bit of logistics information for this webinar session. The webinar presentation itself will take 40 minutes, after which there will be time for questions and answers. You can type your questions in the question field in the software, after which we will present the questions to our presenter, Mr. Patrick Pringle. Or you can raise your hand and ask the question verbally, and on the next slide I will show you where you will find the question field and the hand raising button. Any questions that have not been answered during the 20-minute Q&A session will be answered later on offline and will be published on our website together with a recording of this webinar. During the Q&A session, you will have a raise your hand icon, and webinar facilities will then unmute the microphones for attendees who have raised their hands and who would like to ask their questions verbally. Or you can simply type the question in the question window that's indicated right there. Any questions, as said, that have not been answered during the 20-minute session will be answered offline and later on published on the website. If your question has not been answered, please type it in the question window and we will make sure it gets answered. As a last part of this introduction, let me now introduce to you our presenter of today, Mr. Patrick Pringle of UKCIP. UKCIP works at the boundary between scientific research, policymakers and stakeholders in the public, private and voluntary sectors to develop resources that can enable robust and evidence-based adaptation. Mr. Patrick Pringle joined UKCIP in 2010, and his recent work has included leading the development of UKCIP's Monitoring and Evaluation Toolkit which is called AdaptME, and visiting Taiwan to provide adaptation advice to a range of national and regional bodies. Patrick has a rich background as a management consultant for, among others, the World Bank, IFC, the European Commission and DFID. Patrick Pringle will now present on UKCIP's new monitoring and evaluation resource, the AdaptME Toolkit, which was developed in response to a growing demand for practical support in evaluating adaptation progress and performance. The AdaptME Toolkit does not seek to provide a comprehensive evaluation framework, as it is clear that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to evaluating adaptation. Patrick, I will now give the screen to you.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Thank you. Right, well, good morning from the UK, and good afternoon and good evening to those of you in Asia. My name is Patrick Pringle and I work for the UK Climate Impacts Programme, UKCIP, and today I'm going to present a webinar called Asking the Right Questions, and hopefully it will become clear why it's called Asking the Right Questions as I progress through this presentation.
Patrick, don't forget to click the Show My Screen button in the top of your software.
Oh, apologies. Yes, I thought you might be seeing. How's that? Is that clear now?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Is that clear? Great. Okay. Okay, so the purpose of today really is to introduce you to UKCIP's AdaptME Monitoring and Evaluation Toolkit, which we've recently produced. And what I'll do is illustrate some of the key sections of AdaptME, what it includes, and also how you might go about using it. And also then to examine some of the key questions that we should all be asking really when we're conducting monitoring and evaluation work in the context of climate adaptation work. And those questions really form the basis of this toolkit. And as Dennis has already mentioned, we'll also have some time for some questions and answers. So please do be thinking of the questions you can ask, and hopefully I'll be in a position to provide you with some answers. So first of all, just to reflect on why monitoring and evaluation is important in the context of climate adaptation. I mean, I think it's something we're all well aware of, the importance of monitoring and evaluation in general development work, but I think it has some specific relevance to adaptation. Firstly, climate change is a very complex issue, as I'm sure you'll all be aware, and the adaptation outcomes aren't shaped only by future climate impacts, but also by environmental and social and economic factors, and our response as a society to a changing climate. So it's very hard to necessarily understand what the future will look like, both in terms of understanding the climate impacts through climate modelling and so on, but also understanding how society may change and how society may respond to those changing impacts. So there's a great deal of complexity there wrapped up with climate adaptation. It's also a long-term issue. So often you will hear people talking about, for example, sea level rises in the 2080s, and that seems a long way away, but actually a number of our decisions we make now will be affected by changes, a long way in advance. So we have to deal with these long-term issues. So monitoring and evaluation and understanding what works becomes very important. We're still at an early stage in our understanding, both in terms of how best we should adapt to future climate change, but also in terms of how best to assess our progress in adapting. So because we're at this early stage, learning becomes really essential, and therefore monitoring and evaluation is a mechanism for that learning. And really learning what works or what doesn't work, in which circumstances, how and why, and for what reasons is really important if we're going to adapt effectively in the future. And really that learning can be distilled, if you like, into two twin questions that are kind of quite simple messages for you to remember, which is, so question, are we doing the right things? And then, are we doing things right? So moving on to the AdaptME Toolkit, first of all, what is it exactly? Well, It's a question-based toolkit which encourages users to really examine the process of evaluation in the context of climate adaptation. So it's about challenging users to understand more about the evaluation process in the context of adaptation. And it's based on 10 sections, which are usually titled in terms of a question. And what it does is, under each section, it also signposts users to useful resources and studies that you may find relevant to your work. And it also provides some questions to consider at the end of each section. And these questions to consider are all about challenging you to understand the evaluation process, but also to understand what it means in terms of adaptation. So these are kind of triggers, because as Dennis has already mentioned, there is no one-size-fits-all approach to evaluation, particularly in the context of adaptation. So I'll briefly introduce you to how AdaptME was developed, so you understand a little bit more about the background. It was initiated really through a number of workshops with practitioners and experts, pulling together the fields of climate adaptation and monitoring and evaluation, and a discussion around what the challenges are, what are the core challenges that make monitoring and evaluation often quite difficult in the context of climate change. Alongside those workshops, we've also collaborated with a number of organisations, including the World Resources Institute, who have produced some excellent guidance on monitoring and evaluation, and who I think have also spoken with Sea Change in the past on a webinar. And we've also engaged the UK Evaluation Society as well in that process to understand more from a kind of, if you like, a core evaluation perspective. And we've also drawn upon some considerable experience of evaluation from ourselves within UKCIP and our own experience of adaptation practice. So the idea is that this resource has been developed through a kind of collaborative approach, bringing together the monitoring, the evaluation and climate adaptation communities. And the result has been the toolkit, which we call AdaptME, which is now on the UKCIP website in report form, and I'll provide you with a link to that at the end of this webinar. But alongside the kind of report-based format that we've developed, we're also working on a more interactive online format, which we hope will be launched towards the end of this month, if not early next month, which hopefully will provide you with a bit more of an attractive way in to explore some of these questions, as opposed to solely looking at a report. So next, why have we kind of taken this kind of question-based approach? Why have I called the webinar, if you like, asking the right questions? Well, the question-based approach really, the point of it is it doesn't seek to provide practitioners and users with the end answers, really because the answers are so dependent on your own circumstances. So what are you trying to achieve? What are the local climate impacts likely to be over what time period? What are social and economic circumstances in which you work? These are all factors which shape how you might answer the questions which were raised, and therefore how your evaluation or your monitoring processes should be developed. Another factor is the values and beliefs held by the organisations you work for or the communities you work with, the individuals who might be engaged in a particular intervention. All of these things shape what would be deemed an appropriate monitoring and evaluation response for you. So it's pretty pointless if we were telling you this is the way you must do things, when in fact it will be shaped by your own circumstances, hence the question-based approach. And these questions can really enable you to find your own right answers, if you like. And we found these question-based approaches have been useful throughout UKCIP's work, not just in monitoring and evaluation, but particularly relevant in this case. And they've also been used by some high-profile work elsewhere. For example, I know a number of you will be aware of the Climate Smart Disaster Risk Management approach, which has been developed through the DFID-funded Strengthening Climate Resilience Programme, which again often raises some critical questions at the start of the study, which try and tease out the right answers for individuals. So what can AdaptME help you to do? What can you benefit from by using AdaptME? Well, firstly, it can help you to refine your evaluation purpose and objectives. This is absolutely critical to understand what are you trying to get out of the evaluation process, and really to examine that in quite a deal of depth, so you really understand why you're evaluating, what you're trying to get out of it, what the objectives are. It can help you reflect on not only on what you're trying to evaluate, but the logic that sits behind this. So a particular intervention, has been developed to adapt to climate change in a particular way, based on a series of assumptions and a logic. And we really need to examine that logic to understand if over time it just remained robust and remained appropriate, so that we can potentially make suggestions to improve it in the future. AdaptME can also help you to understand the specific traits of adaptation that can make evaluation quite challenging and make it quite difficult. And actually then, by understanding some of the pitfalls, if you like, some of the things that are particularly problematic, you can then help you to overcome some of those difficult challenges. The toolkit can also help you to draw out and to understand and to really double check some of the assumptions that may have been made during the development of a particular adaptation intervention. And it's really important with this deal of uncertainty and long-term nature of climate change that we really understand the assumptions that were made at different points in time, in order that we can see if they still remain appropriate. It can also help you to consider how progress and performance might be best measured and evaluated, which is often at the heart of M&E, so that's really important. And it can help to identify some examples, some good practice and some ideas which can help ensure that your evaluation is robust, and really it helps you to it signposts you to a number of other resources which you may find useful. And it can also help you to prioritize your evaluation activities. I think that the approach we've taken to developing AdaptME has been to be quite pragmatic and quite practical, and recognise that it's pointless us telling you that you should do everything and anything possible to make your evaluation robust, because we realise that often we're limited by the time that we have, the resources we have available, the financial resources, as I say, the time. And therefore you will need to make difficult choices about how to go about your evaluation in an effective way, and hopefully this toolkit will help you prioritise what are the most important things you really need to be looking at given your purpose and your objectives. And I would also stress that learning is absolutely central to AdaptME, and it seems an obvious thing to say about monitoring and evaluation, that learning should be at the core, but quite often it can become slightly peripheral to other objectives, which can be problematic. So we can be more worried about saying, have we done what we what we said we would do in the first place, instead of really worrying about some of the wider learning and really understanding in depth what has gone on with a particular intervention. And this is really supported by a quote here from Learning to Adapt, which is an excellent piece of work done on learning to adapt monitoring and evaluation approaches in climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction, which is produced as part of the Strengthening Climate Resilience Programme. And I'll mention this again at the moment and later on, and as a reference as well. But they say looking at monitoring and evaluation as a potential tool for enabling learning instead of simply measuring results. And I think that's really important, that we do move towards an approach which is about learning what works, what doesn't, how and why, rather than just worrying about did we do what we said we would do. Now next, there's a rather complex diagram here on your screen at the moment, which I'll try to explain to you. The coloured circles on the outside here represent monitoring and evaluation interventions, if you like. You could think of them as a project, as individual projects. And these illustrate the cyclical process of monitoring and evaluation. So you may design a program, you would then implement it, you would then look to monitor it and undertake maybe an evaluation, and all that information would be used to then improve the project and go back around the cycle. So then you would maybe assess it, learn your lessons, make some tweaks and some changes, implement again, and monitor and evaluate. So that shows the kind of the cyclical process. But what I've also shown is that out of that very kind of project-based approach spins out learning and lessons that can go into the shared space, which is represented by the white circles. And actually it's just as important that learning enters this shared space, so we can compare between projects, we can work across sectors, we can enable ideas to diffuse and to share between different projects and activities. So what I'm trying to represent with this diagram is to show you how monitoring and evaluation is not just about your own project and your own intervention, but it's about sharing that learning, because we are dealing with quite a new topic here, and quite a lot of innovation will be going on, and it's really important that we also benefit from other people's learning and not just have a kind of blinkered view of the world that's only about our own projects. So now what I'm going to do is take you through the 10 sections of AdaptME, just so you have a better understanding of how it's structured and how it might be used. So the first question that we raise in AdaptME is, what is the purpose of my evaluation? And it's really important to get the most out of the process of monitoring and evaluation, that you understand and you're clear on what the purpose of your evaluation is. Why are you undertaking this particular journey, and where do you want to get to? And as this quote says again here, that the nature and focus of monitoring and evaluation will depend on the purpose of your evaluation. And it also very much shapes the methods that you may wish to employ. For example, if your purpose is to assess the efficiency of a particular program, you might well employ kind of cost-benefit analysis to understand the costs and the benefits, and therefore how efficient you've been. But you may actually, if your purpose is slightly different, for example, you may employ a different technique. Therefore, it's really important to understand what is the purpose of your evaluation before you start designing the methodology. And it's also important to recognize that some of those purposes at times can be conflicting, or they can also be complementary. For example, often we might undertake an evaluation with a sense of compliance. So have we complied to the rules of a particular donor? And sometimes that kind of approach can conflict with a wider understanding of learning how the project worked and who benefited and was it equitable and those kind of issues. So you need to understand where those tensions and potential synergies exist within the purposes that you're looking to explore, because that will help you design a more balanced and a more effective evaluation approach. So really it's about kind of looking inward in a way to really understand what are you trying to get out of this process. So the second we'll then move on to the reasons for monitoring and evaluation, which links obviously to the purpose. So here I just illustrate some of the reasons for monitoring and evaluation that the purposes you might wish to which may motivate you in undertaking M&E work. First of all, it may be to evaluate effectiveness, for example, or to improve learning. It might be about providing accountability. As I said, it might be this kind of regulatory role almost, that you're trying to make sure you're accountable to a particular donor. Or it may be about making comparisons. You may be trying to compare two different projects and the approaches they took. You may wish to improve future interventions, so this could be midway through a particular program. Or you may wish to assess efficiency, so for example, cost-benefit analysis may come in there as well. Or it may be about assessing the outcomes. Have you delivered what you said you would deliver, and have those been successful? Or it may be around understanding equity. How fair and how just has the response been in terms of climate adaptation? So these are all different motivations, different purposes, different reasons for undertaking monitoring and evaluation, and you really need to understand and explore what your purposes are. So the second section of AdaptME is about asking the question, what is it that I'm evaluating? What are the characteristics of the particular intervention I'm looking at, in order that I understand the best techniques to employ? And one distinction that AdaptME highlights is the difference between building adaptive capacity and delivering adaptation actions. Now, building adaptive capacity is about creating the information and the conditions needed to enable adaptation actions to be undertaken. And I liken it in some ways as the picture to the right here is a plant growing in soil, and I kind of see it, building adaptive capacity is about preparing that soil, ensuring it's nutritious, it's watered, it's healthy, in order that adaptation actions can then be delivered effectively and can grow and flourish. So adaptation actions refer to the kind of reduction of vulnerability to climate risk by taking a particular action or to exploit a particular opportunity. So there's a nuance, a difference between those two types of things that you may wish to evaluate, and that you would then employ potentially different techniques in trying to monitor or evaluate adaptive capacity and measure adaptive capacity. You would use potentially different techniques than you would if you're measuring, for example, how successful a particular sea defence has been, which would be an adaptation action. So we make the distinction on our AdaptME toolkit between those two types of adaptation. which you may well find useful in working out the best techniques to employ. So the third section of AdaptME is around asking the question, what logic and assumptions underpin the intervention that I'm evaluating? Because an effective evaluation needs to really understand the thinking that lies behind the original objectives of the intervention. A particular project or program will have been developed with a logic underpinning it, and we really need to be able to test that logic, particularly given the uncertainty and the long timescales within which we may be working. So we find it useful to actually explore these issues in terms of an adaptation logic model, which provides a kind of visual description of the adaptation process that was originally envisaged and had been planned, and then you can understand how you may go about evaluating that and understanding some of the subtleties around that. And it's important that we actually challenge some of those assumptions and explore those unintended and unexpected outcomes and impacts which may have occurred. So what I'll do now is I'll show you the AdaptME. We came up with a kind of hypothetical example of a project which was about commercial building overheating, and it was a project around that, a hypothetical project, and we used that hypothetical project to illustrate the adaptation logic model in the AdaptME toolkit. So you'll see the logic model really follows, it's quite a traditional, if you like, log frame type approach in one sense, in that it refers to the inputs, the activities, the outputs, the outcomes and the impacts, and really tries to use those to identify what those are for a particular project. But what it also does is it also looks at some of the assumptions that have been made in each of those levels, so we can then, those are then revealed, those are laid down on the table clearly. We understand what assumptions were made at the time the project was initiated, and we can test whether those assumptions are still valid and still appropriate. On the left-hand side, we also want to identify the unintended outcomes and the unexpected impacts that have occurred, so that we don't just measure have we done what we said we would do, but we actually evaluate what really happened and what some of the wider, broader lessons could be learned through the evaluation process. And this particular logic model draws a lot upon the World Resources Institute work as well, and I must sort of commend them for some excellent work. We've kind of adapted this from that base. So once we've understood a little bit more about the logic that underpins the particular approach that we're looking to evaluate, we then look at what are the challenges that you might face when evaluating adaptation performance. And AdaptME really identifies a series of what we've called tricky issues that can make evaluation of adaptation interventions particularly difficult or particularly challenging. And these were identified through the workshops that I mentioned earlier on, that we held 2 workshops with practitioners. And these were the ones that came out as the, if you like, the tricky issues that people struggle with when they're trying to monitor and evaluate in the context of climate adaptation. And the first of these is coping with uncertainty, and I think I've already mentioned uncertainty a number of times, but it's really important that there's a huge degree of uncertainty, not just around the future climate impacts, what the biophysical impacts may be. Of course there's uncertainty around those in terms of climate modelling. We don't necessarily know exactly what will happen, but also in terms of emission scenarios, which then obviously shape those models, but also our social and economic and cultural often responses that we have to those uncertainties. So it's very hard to understand exactly how effective an adaptation option will be if we don't understand some of those uncertainties. But actually we will never solve all of those uncertainties. We can never expect to be monitoring and evaluating in complete certainty. So we need to be able to deal with that uncertainty, and I'll come on to that later on. But that's explored in more depth in the AdaptME toolkit. The second tricky issue is around dealing with long timescales, which is again another very challenging thing. The fact that we're often trying to adapt to a future climate a long way ahead, and we're making decisions potentially which lock us into financial and social commitments over a number of years, over potentially 50, 80, 100 years, when the circumstances in the future may be very different. So we're dealing with long timescales, which in itself is challenging. It's also often difficult to deal with what we call the counterfactual, what would have happened anyway. And this is difficult because often we're talking about avoiding climate impacts. So how do I measure whether I've avoided a particular impact if the whole point is it's been avoided. So it becomes quite a difficult issue to then understand what would have happened anyway. The fourth issue is around attribution. It's very difficult to attribute a particular benefit or a particular cost of an adaptation intervention to a single project or program. Partly because of this long time scale, it's very hard to say my project was the reason that people developed the capacity and therefore were able to cope with increased flood occurrences. It's very hard to actually attribute that to one particular project, and not actually necessarily all that helpful, but attribution is a challenging issue. Also, identifying appropriate success measures. This is another difficult area, often because whose perspective do we take on success? And it's very hard to decide on which angle we take on in terms of measuring success, and when is it appropriate to use what type of indicators. So again, that's something that's covered in AdaptME. When can metrics be useful? What type of process indicators might be useful versus outcome indicators and output indicators? So there's a lot of issues around success measures that can make that challenging. And finally, I've already mentioned learning, but learning is absolutely critical, and how we go about embedding that learning and ensuring that we share learning between projects and interventions is really important and something we need to think about. And what AdaptME does is suggest some different responses that you might take to all of those different tricky issues. And I'll give just an example of one of those, just so you get a flavour of how we've gone about doing that. So, for example, how do we deal with long timescales, the challenge of long timescales and monitoring and evaluation? And here are a few of the suggestions we make in AdaptME, and these are obviously explored in greater depth in the report itself, but I'll just give you a flavour. First of all, adaptation needs to be reviewed as an iterative, formative process. It's an ongoing process, and if you view adaptation in that context, it's easier to deal with those long timescales. It's also important that to make your assumptions clear through using an adaptation logic model, as I've illustrated. Those long time frames can mean your assumptions are likely to change over time. Therefore, it's important that you map those out so you understand the assumptions that were made, and you can go ahead and test those over the time period. It's also important to ensure that regular monitoring and evaluation is in place to help progress to be tracked. And I think that's where monitoring has a really important role in dealing with long timescales, because we need to keep looking and keep examining our assumptions, keep examining what's going on, the changing social, economic, environmental circumstances in which we may be operating, to see if our adaptations are still appropriate and they're still heading in what seems a sensible direction. The use of process indicators to determine whether progress is on track is also useful. Because often we can't actually determine whether the final impacts or the final outcomes have been achieved, because we haven't reached the end of the project. But often understanding the process and identifying some measures of that process can be really helpful, just to determine whether the direction of travel is appropriate. And it's also really important to understand the decision lifetime of your adaptation intervention. And what I mean by that is a combination of the time it takes to develop and execute a project, which you could call the lead time, combined with the consequence time, which is the time with which your consequence will last, your decision will last. So, for example, a power station might take 25 years to develop and execute and construct, but then actually you may expect that power station to be in existence for another 60 years. So suddenly you've got a decision lifetime of 85 years. But it's really important to understand what are the critical moments within that 85-year time period. When do you need to make key decisions, and really understand that? So, and where can you build in maximum flexibility? Because actually, what we don't want to do is lock ourselves into potentially maladaptive responses. Because we've taken a decision in 2012, we may later get more evidence and find out it's completely inappropriate to have made that choice, and that information may come along in 2014, yet we still have another sort of 83 years of commitment there ahead. So we really want to build in and retain as much flexibility in our decision making as possible in order to cope with these long timescales. And monitoring and evaluation plays a really important role in providing the check and the ability to see how we're getting on. So what are the limitations, sorry, the fifth stage of the adaptation of the AdaptME toolkit? What are the limitations placed upon my evaluation? And this is really about being quite practical and quite pragmatic and recognizing that there will be financial constraints, there will be time constraints, the time you've got available to do the evaluation work, or the deadline you've got to meet for a particular donor or whoever it may be. And there may also be limitations on the scope of the project and the level of interest of the person that's funding it. What area they may have a particular agenda or a particular interest. So all those things present some form of limitation on what you can achieve in terms of M&E, and they need to be recognised and need to be overt, because actually you may be able to do something about those. So you need to check whether the evaluation you've got in mind appears proportionate. You know, if you're spending $50,000 on an adaptation project, the chances of you spending $30,000 on the evaluation is pretty slim and wouldn't necessarily be proportionate. So you need to think about what's realistic. And also then think about how some of the constraints may be overcome. It may be that a conversation with your donor or your funder to say, actually the timescales are not quite appropriate for the work we want to do. You may be able to adjust those. So there may be opportunities to overcome some of those constraints, or potentially make a case for some additional funding if that would be possible. And also think about, when you've defined your monitoring and evaluation approach, you will have made trade-offs, you will have had to make difficult choices about what's possible in the time and the resources you have. And can you justify those choices that you've made? And I think it's really important to go back, once you've come up with an evaluation approach, to just think, actually I've made some difficult choices, but am I confident they were the right ones? And now moving on to section 6 of AdaptME, which is about measuring progress and performance. And what we've done is looked at 3 different ways of measuring progress and performance within the toolkit. The first is about measuring against the objectives of the intervention, which I think is important, but is often a kind of the common approach that you'd expect to see in any monitoring evaluation approach. It's comparing the outputs and the outcomes against which your project was intended to achieve. So you're checking whether you've done essentially what you said you would do, which is really important. But such an approach doesn't always consider whether those were actually the right things to be doing in the first place. It can be there's a real danger there that we simply evaluate and monitor against what we said we would do, instead of asking, were we doing the right things in the first place? So that has a place, but we need to maybe think a bit beyond that. We also need to evaluate and monitor progress against an emerging understanding of what good adaptation might be. So AdaptME outlines some of the characteristics of good adaptation that have been identified in various literature, in both academically and in practical implementation. And we look at those and try and work out how you could use those as the basis for understanding whether you're moving in the right direction. So there's certain criteria of characteristics of good adaptation which can be used, against which your performance might be measured. You can also measure against a baseline, which is again a common approach, a kind of snapshot of conditions established before the start of the project, against which you can monitor your progress. Now this can be inherently tricky with climate change, because the baseline can be seen to move over time. So for example, if your project was around conserving a wetland, if those basic climatic and biophysical conditions in the wetland are changing, what are you trying to conserve? Are you trying to conserve it as it was originally, or how it's changing over time? What's your objective? So establishing a baseline isn't always an easy thing to measure against, but it remains a useful tool. The seventh section of AdaptME is about establishing evaluation criteria, and it really moves us on to looking at indicators and metrics. And what we do in this section is identify 2 types of indicators which might be useful, and obviously there are many types of indicators you could use, but we find it useful to make the distinction between process-based indicators, which I've mentioned in the earlier on, and outcome-based indicators. So process-based indicators are particularly valuable where we haven't necessarily reached the endpoint and it's very hard to measure the outcomes. But actually, if we understand the process, the key stages of the process that we're undertaking, we can use these to understand whether we're heading in the right direction or not. Now, outcome-based indicators are always very popular with donors and with organisations, understandably, because they tell us about whether we've reached an explicit outcome, so they seem quite concrete. But obviously with climate adaptation, it's often quite difficult to determine some of those outcomes when we haven't necessarily reached the point at which a particular adaptation has been tested. So we might have built ourselves a lovely sea defence that's supposed to last 80 years, but who can honestly say they can determine the outcome of that when we don't know what the state the oceans may be in 80 years' time? So it can be quite challenging there. And we can also examine the role of metrics within the AdaptME toolkit, which is looking about around the issue of quantification of adaptation indicators. Now, these can be really useful, and lots of people like it when we can quantify things. It seems very concrete, seems very robust, and it's certainly something that is very useful. But it's also sometimes can be problematic when we commit ourselves to inappropriate quantification and inappropriate indicators. So we need to think about which indicators are appropriate when and how, and that's all explored in greater depth within AdaptME. Section 8 of AdaptME really looks at how do I evaluate the unintended and the unexpected, which is something I've already mentioned within the adaptation logic model. But it's really important that the evaluation is designed in a way that's sufficiently flexible to explore the unexpected outcomes that may occur. And this is really important because adaptation is quite a new field and we're still exploring what works and what doesn't. We really need to have our eyes open to the unexpected and things that happen that we maybe hadn't planned to happen, but maybe actually really good things. There may be things that we would use in the future. But if we take a very rigid approach to monitoring and evaluation, we don't always capture some of those outcomes. So some of the suggestions we make in AdaptME are around designing, using an iterative approach to designing monitoring and evaluation approaches, which really enables you to adapt as you go along and spot those opportunities to look at the unexpected and the unintended. And another way is to actually to potentially use a scoping stage. So have an initial scoping stage to begin to tease out some of those interesting ideas that may have been emerging through your work, and then you can tweak your monitoring and evaluation approach to reflect those unintended and unexpected outcomes that you may be beginning to spot. We also recommend the use of participatory techniques, open questions, and things that really allow participants to explain what they think worked well or didn't work very well and why they think it might have done. And this is really important, particularly at community level, where you really need to tease out who benefited in what way and why, and maybe who didn't benefit, who may have suffered as a result of the action that was taken, so we can avoid maladaptation. And the final point with the unintended and the unexpected is to say, you may identify some unintended impacts that don't seem massively relevant to your work, but actually they may be really, really, really useful for someone else's work. So try and flag them up and try and share them within wider communities, see if other people have had the same thing go on with their project. And that's the way we can learn as a community rather than just in isolation. So who should I involve in the evaluation? This is the ninth section of AdaptME. And we provide some information here on different participatory approaches in monitoring and evaluation and some of the challenges you might face when you're working out who should be the right people and how do you ask them the right questions. Now there's a huge amount of literature on participatory approaches, and we just really touch the surface of this, but certainly give you some useful references to other sources of information that help you sort of find the most appropriate technique for your evaluation. And it's really around seeking to engage stakeholders from a range of different levels and relationships within an intervention, to get a really wide view of the project so we can understand as a broader picture as possible. And also evaluations which are able to engage that wider range of stakeholders are more likely to, as I say, to gain this more complete picture. And it's also an opportunity to explore issues of social justice, to understand whether some of the benefits or disbenefits of a project have been kind of how they've been distributed. Have they been what effect have they had on different communities, different groups within the project, and then potentially gives you the opportunity to then address any unbalanced outcomes that have occurred. And the final section of AdaptME is about how you should communicate the findings. And again, this is, as with all these questions, it's all about your own experiences, and it's all about you finding the right answers for yourself. There is no single approach to communicating the findings. But what we would emphasize is the importance of thinking when to communicate, and that communication with stakeholders isn't just about dissemination at the end of an evaluation process or putting a report on your website. It's a two-way process of communication in order to really enrich the project with learning. So have you set up the mechanisms that enable different people to have views and communicate their opinions effectively? And really you need to think about what is the purpose for communicating, why are you wanting to communicate, and with whom, what are the likely audiences, because that will very much shape the communication approaches you may take. Written reports, I know we all work in the land of written reports, I'm sure, which is great for us, but actually for a lot of people that's not the best way to communicate. So it may be, you can use websites, individual meetings, public events, social media is increasingly being used. It may be a community meeting. There's lots of different ways of communicating messages, and we need to think about who you're targeting and what message you're trying to get across in order to identify the best means of communication. So what would be appropriate to that audience? And the final point I make on this slide, which I think is really important, is are there communities of practice with whom the findings can be shared? I mean, this forum is a great example of that. We're all doing different things, busy working on adaptation, doing our monitoring and evaluation, but who can we share this with so that we share our lessons and maybe others won't make the mistakes that we will be making? And before I end, I would just like to identify some of the synergies that AdaptME as a toolkit has with some really useful literature that I've come across in doing this work. And the first piece of work I'm going to refer you to is Learning to Adapt, Monitoring and Evaluation Approaches in Climate Change Adaptation and Disaster Risk Reduction, which was produced in 2011 as part of this Strengthening Climate Resilience Programme, which the Department for International Development of the UK government have funded. And they identify some really interesting points which I think chime quite well with what AdaptME has been trying to do. And they make the point that current approaches to monitoring and evaluation tend to focus on the what rather than the how and the why, and I think we're really trying to get to the how and the why with evaluation rather than just thinking about what happened. Well, how did it happen and why? They also make the point that monitoring evaluation needs to take a perspective which really enhances learning, and it needs to be a tool for learning, not just about simply measuring results and this kind of classic did I do what I said I would do line, and it needs to be much wider than that. And the diversity of adaptation needs to be acknowledged, because adaptation does really cut across a range of sectors. It's not very rarely is it focused on one sector, and it also works on multiple scales, which can make it, again, this links to the issue of complexity, but it's really important we acknowledge that diversity. And in doing so, adaptation really and AdaptME and monitoring and evaluation process need to recognise that there's no one-size-fits-all framework when it comes to M&E. It's what's appropriate to you that really matters. And the fourth point they make, well, they make a lot of points, but this is just four I've picked out from this report, is the importance of using monitoring and evaluation frameworks that account for those unintended impacts, and also that recognise that potential trade-offs need to be made and will be made, and really to bring out what those assumptions are that lie behind those trade-offs. And as I've already mentioned, those are themes that are throughout AdaptME as a toolkit. And the second report that I think is really useful to look at is this Making Adaptation Count by the World Resources Institute, which is again a really excellent piece of work on monitoring and evaluation in the context of adaptation. And I've picked out some of the points that were made at a workshop that they held at I think it was at Cancun, that was particularly useful and particularly relevant to the work we've been doing on monitoring and evaluation. And they made the excellent point that one size does not fit all. That funders, practitioners, users, community groups, and all sorts of people all have a distinct approach and a distinct need for monitoring and evaluation, and they all have their own interests, which is fine, but what that means is that there's no point in UKCIP introducing a kind of uniform approach to monitoring and evaluation, and that's why we've taken this question-based approach. It's about you finding the route and the approach that's most appropriate to your needs. Second point is not to reinvent the wheel, and I think this is something I see a lot with climate change, is that as soon as you see the two words climate change in a paragraph, people think you have to come up with something new because it seems like a new topic. But very often there's a huge amount of material we can draw on in the broader monitoring and evaluation field that can be really useful. And whilst I have highlighted that adaptation does have particular traits which makes monitoring and evaluation quite challenging, it's not necessarily entirely unique. And we shouldn't always look to reinvent the wheel. There are useful, really useful lessons to learn, for example, from medicine, where they're looking at understanding long-term health benefits of, for example, child nutrition. What impact does that have on a grown adult? So they face similar problems there with complexity and understanding long time frames. So there's lessons we can learn, and I think we need to be probably a bit better at that across different sectors. The third point that I've identified here is about getting out of the project box, and this is really just reinforcing that point about learning not just being about your own project or your own program. We've got to share this learning and really look beyond individual projects. And the fourth point is about aiming for the weak spots. And what the World Resources Institute meant by this is that we really need to understand where monitoring and evaluation is weak in terms of climate adaptation, and really aim to plug those gaps. And then we've used that message really as the basis for a large section of the AdaptME toolkit in identifying those tricky issues that I mentioned earlier on. Because I think we really need to face the things that make adaptation difficult, monitoring and evaluation difficult, sorry. We need to face those head on so we can really find the appropriate responses. So those are, again, synergies between World Resources Institute's work and our own. And I'd recommend you to go to both of those reports, both very useful resources on monitoring and evaluation and adaptation. So I think now we'll move on to questions and answers. So I've been talking for quite a long time. I would just point you to the link at the bottom of this slide here, which is where you will find the AdaptME toolkit, and also when we develop the online toolkit, that would also be in that same area. So you should be able to find everything there, and I do encourage you to use it. And please do get in touch and provide me with feedback. Thank you very much, and I'll now let Dennis introduce the Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for your presentation. That was very interesting. I especially myself like the point on criteria for indicators and metrics, and also point 8 about the unintended and unexpected. I would like to ask Anna Koglen, our regional M&E advisor, if she would like to kick off the Q&A session with the first question.
Yes, yes, thank you, Dennis. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, I think so. I hear you.
Okay, okay, great. It's always hard to talk to this blank, silent wall. Yes, I'm PAC's M&E advisor, regional advisor for Asia and Eurasia, and I'm a long-time practitioner, monitoring and evaluation practitioner, and I've only recently come to the field of climate change and evaluating climate change interventions. So my perspective that I'm looking at this, the lens as through monitoring and evaluation. And I think it's very interesting, Patrick, how you and your team and other folks that you've built off of, you've taken some, very common sense, very basic M&E principles and applied them to climate change adaptation. And it's very useful to see that the way in which you've actually adapted, sorry for the pun, those tools and processes. I think it's interesting to think about what's common to basic principles, what's unique, what you've brought to this that's different, and then also possibly some things that might be missing or might be tweaked a bit more. As you said, building further on what we know, lessons learned from doing monitoring and evaluation of development projects for many years. So with that in mind, I'd like, and the fact that we don't have much time, I'd like to turn it over for questions for folks to, again, think about what are some of the common points with good M&E practice, what's some of the unique points that are brought when it's applied to climate change adaptation, and then of course anything else that people want to raise.
Thank you for that, Anna. I'm currently looking at the questions, and I'm picking one of Samim Siddiqui. And the question is, some programs with broader scope may make good contributions to climate change adaptation. How can AdaptME be integrated with the broader M&E system of that program, or vice versa? And I would like to add to that, how can AdaptME be integrated with the broader M&E system of an organization that is doing that program?
I think that's a really good question, and I think that lies at the heart of the approach we took to developing AdaptME, was that we didn't want to set out a framework, because at the end of the day there are very few projects that are, if you like, adaptation projects. They aim to achieve much broader social, economic or environmental goals, and adaptation is, they try and deliver those in a changing climate. So there are very few projects that, if you like, are core adaptation. So it's really important that we designed it in a way that the idea is that you will be able to incorporate that into a broader framework. And I think what way I would suggest doing it is really to go through the toolkit and to try and ask those questions of your existing framework. So there's no need to necessarily, move away from what you're already doing or your already approaches, but raise those questions, raise those challenges, test those assumptions of your existing approach, and then if it needs tweaking, then I think you've got a strong case to say, well, actually maybe we need to do this bit slightly differently, or maybe we need to interpret this part of our framework slightly differently than we would do traditionally. So I think those questions can be used actually to reflect upon and challenge your if you like, your more conventional framework that's designed to deal with a broader scope.
Thank you for that. I see another question here. She was operating in a published set of metrics for evaluating progress. How
Sorry, Dennis, I'm struggling to hear you. I think Anna's in the same boat by the sense of it.
The question is if there is a published set of metrics for evaluating progress. The question is if there is a published set of metrics for evaluating progress. Are there quantitative, already set out metrics that can be used or adapted?
Sorry, so the question was, are there already metrics out there, essentially?
Yes, that was a question from Virginie Fajol.
I think there will be, in different circumstances, there will be, absolutely, and I think I would urge people to use data that's already been gathered as a useful source of indicators, and there are already indicators and metrics that have been established which can be used. I think what's important is using AdaptME to reflect on whether those are appropriate is the key. If they are, then great, because actually, if the data has already been gathered and the metrics have been established, it saves you time, it saves you resources to maybe focus your M&E in a different area and your resources. So absolutely. I think the critical thing is, though, is not to be, if you like, a little bit lazy if there's already indicators developed and just accept those default. I think you need to test those, and do they answer the questions that you're trying to answer, or because often we're dealing with proxy indicators when it comes to adaptation, because we can't actually, it's very hard to measure adaptation itself. We use proxies to reflect that. Now we really need to understand and test whether those proxies are appropriate to what we're trying to understand. So I would urge people absolutely to use what's already out there, but just to double check that it's, understand its limitations, test it, play with it, work out what's useful, and just have that common sense of caution about which ones are good and which ones are maybe not appropriate.
Okay, I think you have your speaker a bit loud, Patrick. Do you hear me well?
So I can hear you now, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that answered it quite well. I got another question in from Samim Siddiqui, who says, while many things are affected by climate change, some changes that we see in the environment may not be there due to climate change. Should we also ask some key questions in the process of designing climate change adaptation interventions? And should perhaps AdaptME include also a section on designing adaptation interventions, given that design is very closely linked to M&E?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll take your second point first about designing. I mean, absolutely, and I think if we may need to make that a bit clearer, but we see that this is a really important issue. I think is that AdaptME ideally would be used at the beginning of the process before you've even designed your intervention, because it gets you to ask a lot of the questions you're actually trying to ask are things that you should have thought about at the beginning. What we did in coming up with AdaptME was to recognise that often in the real world we don't often worry about monitoring and evaluation until halfway through a project, or until we realise it's at the bottom of the list of activities we have to deliver under a particular contract, and we go, okay, right, monitoring and evaluation is coming up now, we're reaching the end of the project. So we kind of had to realise that kind of pragmatic thing, that people often don't think about it when they should. But the attendees absolutely bang on right, saying that we should be thinking about this as a part of the design process of an intervention, because actually if we've asked some of those questions we'll design something better in the first place. So I think that's a really good point, and it's certainly something I'll look at in terms of whether we've got that message across correctly within AdaptME. It's a good point. Could you just re-emphasize what was the first part of that question? I'll come back to that.
The first part of that question was whether AdaptME should include a section on design.
Well, I think it's certainly something we'll consider, and I think the idea is that this would help you design a monitoring and evaluation process, but what we haven't said is it will help you design your full adaptation approach. Now, what I would say is that AdaptME sits within a broader context on UKCIP's kind of toolkit. It sits within what's called the Adaptation Wizard, which takes you through the whole adaptation process. So I would suggest looking at one of the reasons we've not used it as the kind of starting point for designing an adaptation intervention is because it sits within the broader Adaptation Wizard, which is our tool for kind of understanding the whole adaptation process. So that's probably the best place to start, is to look at the Adaptation Wizard and see how it sits within that, and I can provide reference to that much kind of broader tool we have on the UKCIP website.
Okay, I will make sure that it is also part of the information that we share after this website on Sea Change. I'm looking at the questions. I have another one here, and that is Virginie. She asks, can the tool be used in the context of national adaptation plans?
That's a good question. I don't see any reason why it couldn't. I mean, I think the idea is it's supposed to be as flexible as possible, so there's no reason. I can't imagine that any of those questions wouldn't be relevant to a national adaptation plan. Yeah, I mean, it'd certainly be an interesting exercise to see how well it mapped onto that. I mean, we tended to focus in its development more on thinking about project and program level adaptation rather than the kind of broad national adaptation plan. But certainly, I mean, I think that would be a fascinating exercise. In principle, it should be the same approach. But it would be interesting to see how well it would map on.
Anna, do you have anything to add to this question with respect to national adaptation plans?
Just to reiterate what Patrick said, I think that's spot on. What this toolkit offers is is the process that's used to design a purposeful evaluation, and one that matches the program, the project, or even at the national level. It's that series of questions of evaluative thinking, or the logic of building a plan, an M&E plan, to fit whatever it is that's being evaluated. What I'm a bit surprised at, though, is not taking it one step further, Patrick, and I know that you guys must have considered this, and maybe it's in there more implicitly, is the actual use of information. So that in deciding the purpose of the evaluation, or the monitoring, as it may be, is that it should be around how that information will actually be used, and then at the end of full circle, not only ending with how the information is communicated, but how we actually get it used, how we facilitate the use, and feeding back into project planning oftentimes. Can you comment on something like that, on what you considered or didn't consider?
No, I think that's a really good point. I think that's something we could certainly look at building in. I mean, I guess what we were thinking is that if you are looking at the reasons and the purpose for evaluation, in doing that you're kind of implicitly beginning to explore the uses, but maybe that's something we need to bring out a bit more. But absolutely, I mean, I think if you understand the reasons that you're evaluating, what you're trying to achieve, you're kind of then getting to very close to understanding the use of the information, and then that, as you say, links back in when you talk about communicating it. But that's a really good point. I think it's something we should probably reflect on and see if we need to be more explicit in that.
I'm getting another question from Guy Jobbins, and he asks, is sustainability of evaluation addressed? The majority of M&E occurs within time-limited projects, whilst the toolkit already recognizes the long-term nature of adaptation. Are there ideas in the toolkit about building evaluation capacity within partners, handing over results and processes and so on, to guarantee the sustainability of the evaluation?
No, I think that's another really good point there. We don't kind of get into that level of detail in one sense about kind of, if you like, I mean, it comes back to the diagram that I showed about learning, and about actually the process of trying to bring out the learning that stays within the project, which is a cyclical process, which is something that needs to be managed, but then also this kind of spinning out and sharing that, and if you like, that is kind of part of the process of handing over the knowledge to different groups. So I think that's a really good point. In terms of, could you expand a little bit more on what you meant by sustainability?
Sustainability mainly towards the longer term nature of adaptation programming.
Yeah, I mean, I guess where we refer to that is more about this kind of retention of flexibility and this kind of iterative process, and seeing adaptation very much as a process that's ongoing, and not viewing it as a kind of, you know, a starting point and an end point, and we end it when we produce an evaluation report. But actually to say adaptation is much more of an ongoing process where we need to, and that's where the sustainability comes in, because it should be this iterative approach where we're improving and adapting and providing flexible responses all the time, rather than just saying, right, we said we would do this at point A, and now we'll evaluate whether we did it at point B, and then that's the end of the story. But I think it's a really good point about who is involved in the sustainability of the work. So when you produce your evaluation at the end, who uses that, and how do they use it, and how do we facilitate that to be used most effectively by the people that most need to use it?
And with that you mean the use of that information for follow-up evaluations?
Well, yeah, it could be by anyone really, and that's the point of why it's so important to engage the right people, because it might be for a future evaluation, but it might also be for the community who's being affected. It might be, you know, there's a whole range of people that potentially use the outcomes and the output from an evaluation, and we shouldn't just think of it in terms of it's to be used by the donor or the funder or the person that undertook the evaluation. You know, the results should be as usable for as many groups as possible, in my view.
And as such, it should also be useful within partners, for example. That is what Guy is asking here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's where, if you've thought through who you're looking to engage in the evaluation process, you should then be thinking about providing them with material that allows them to use it in the future, and therefore facilitates the sustainability of that knowledge.
Thank you for that answer, and I wanted to ask the attendees if there are any other questions. For the moment, I don't see any. There's one question coming. I'll take this as the last question for this session. That's by Samim Siddiqui. And he asks, shouldn't we also include focus on the policy advocacy potential of M&E findings?
Yeah, again, I think that's another excellent point. I think that's right. I mean, I think we need to use these results to inform policy, and that's where this process of learning needs to, it's a combination of this. This is where the spin out, if you like, from the project level or program level intervention really needs to occur. We really need to use the results from different projects and allow that knowledge to spin out into different, you know, as an advocacy tool or to inform policy. Absolutely. And that's, if you remember that strange diagram that I've got that's has the different coloured shapes in the middle, that shared space in the middle is exactly what I think he's talking about in the context of informing policy and using it as an advocacy tool. We really need to get the knowledge out of project and program evaluations and use it to inform a much broader audience.
I think that's a very good last point. I'm wondering, Anna, do you have anything to add or to ask as a really final question?
No, I don't. It's one of those things that once we get started, when do we stop? But meaning that it's been very thought-provoking, very interesting, and very, very useful in furthering this, as you said, Patrick, this relatively new field. And I just greatly appreciate the approach of flexibility, the focus on learning, and defining the purpose. Purpose should drive method, as we always say in evaluation. So I greatly thank you and for presenting this.
Also from my side here in Phnom Penh, I would like to thank you for taking the time this afternoon, your morning, to give us these lessons. And I was wondering if you have any final last words, final lesson for us, for the M&E people that are still here in the audience.
What I would say is that in developing AdaptME, we've engaged as many practitioners as we could, but what we haven't done yet properly is to actually test this in the field on projects and programs and activities. So if people think it's a useful toolkit and are beginning to use it, please do get in touch. Let me know how you get on. Happy to provide, you know, what support I can in facilitating that process. So, you know, what we want to do now is get out there, get it used in the field, and make changes and improvements however we can. So, if you're minded to kind of use some of this work, please do get in touch, and you know, I'd love to hear from you.
I think that's a very good final point, because quite often we see basically a maladaptation or a gap between the frameworks being developed and then later on the actual implementation and testing of these frameworks. And it's very important that organizations take their time and pilot these frameworks and such toolkits as well, because in the end it does better the way that organizations do M&E of their programs. Patrick, thank you again for your time. I would like to hereby close this webinar session. Let me thank the panelists that were here today as well, and all of you attendees. The information will be made available later on through SeaChange, And in that information we will also give the contact details of Patrick, so he can be reached if you would be interested in testing this AdaptME toolkit. And also the links to this session will be made online, will be made available online. Thank you everyone, and let me wish everyone in Asia a good evening and a good morning, afternoon to everyone in Europe. Thank you.